Good morning. Welcome to Skipton Baptist Church online. We're today drawing our short series on Colossians to a close. And as we do so, let's think about where we've come from. This is a great letter to a fledgling church community in the south central area of Turkey, of Asia Minor. And it's within the mighty and great Roman Empire, which has influenced all aspects of their daily lives. And it's a church that was doing really, really well, but it was vulnerable to influence, those who would influence, who were adding things on to the heart of the gospel and robbing the Colossians of their sense of security and confidence in who they were in Jesus, and directing them into ways of living which were incorrect and not compatible with Jesus. And with Paul, we've journeyed from the cosmic supremacy of Jesus to Jesus freeing us from the trappings of law through his own grace shown on the cross, and how we should be living that out in our lives over the past couple of chapters. And now we come to chapter 4. And I want us to look initially from chapter 4, verses 2 to 6. And it's where Paul draws this letter to a close, and he, as ever, throws some tiny phrases, some nuggets of wisdom out, which in themselves carry huge weight. And perhaps one of the key ones for us to zoom in on at the very start is the importance of prayer. From chapter 1, where Paul outlines his own prayer for the Colossian church and how much he wants them to grow and know Jesus, he circles back to the end here, and he puts the challenge and the onus back onto them. And he says, devote yourselves to prayer. Devote, because he says we need to do that because prayer is simple, isn't it? It's just talking with God. Prayer is simple, but a prayer lifestyle is often not easy. It requires devotion, and that works itself out in a sense of decision, of dedication, and of discipline. And Paul refers to Epaphras even wrestling in prayer for the Colossians. You see, we give time and effort to what is important to us. Have you ever stepped back and thought about what your prayers consist of? Invariably, they reveal what's important to us, and also reveals the nature of our relationship with God. Devotion, decision, dedication, and discipline leads to depth in our relationship with Jesus. No longer something of what you do, but as part of who you are. And in this context of the importance of prayer, Paul says we need to be watchful and thankful. What does he mean by watchful and thankful? Well, I think watchful means to pray with your eyes open. We so often close our eyes when we pray, don't we? You know the old standard, close your eyes, put your hands together. But I know it's to keep distractions out and to focus. But metaphorically, I think Paul is reminding us that we need to pray with open eyes, seeing what is going on in the reality of the world around us, which fuels our prayer life, for intercession, but also for thankfulness, keeping our eyes open to see where God is at work, where he's answering prayers, for us to pray from a place of response to God's goodness and not as a religious duty. This is why thanksgiving so often makes an appearance in Paul's pleas for the church in regards to the importance of prayer. He moves on in verse 3 to say, and pray for us too, that God may open a door for our message. Paul is an apostle of Jesus Christ. He's an evangelist supremo, pioneer of the mission which led to the Colossae church's planting in the first place. He's teacher, pastor with authority and care for the church in Colossae, and yet he asks for their prayers for him. I remember having some significant spiritual role models in my life, heroes I would even say, and I recall one occasion being asked by one of them, after they prayed for me, they turned to me and said, asked if I would pray for them. And I had a moment of, I don't understand what you've just said to me. What do you mean, me pray for you? It's meant to be the other way around, isn't it? And I'm sure I prayed, I'm sure I fumbled over my words thinking, how can my prayers be of any use compared to ... But they were, and they are, and Paul here is asking to be prayed for. I shared this a little while ago at a church meeting recently with the questions of who is praying for you? Who is backing you up? Who do you know as your prayer support? And who are you praying for? Not just anonymously, but Do they know that you're praying for them and you're praying for them in a committed, dedicated way? But Paul's prayer is that God may open a door for the message. He's currently in prison, and he's not asking for a door to be open for him to have freedom from prison. He's asking for a door to be open for the gospel. In whatever situation that he finds himself, that he do a decent job in explaining it. I mean, think about that, asking God to help him do a decent job in explaining the gospel. How many times will Paul have preached that gospel? How many people had he spoken to and led to Christ? How many places had he planted new communities of Jesus followers? And yet he's still asking for prayer in order to be effective. Now it communicates that he's not reliant on his skill or experience, that it's still in the Lord's hands. He's asking for prayer to make the most of opportunities, and that's what he encourages next, the Colossian congregation. He reminds them in their role in seeking opportunities and how to use them. He says, be wise in the way that you act towards outsiders. I think this is a great word for all of us, whether you consider yourself an evangelist or not. How we act towards others, especially if they know that we're followers of Jesus, can either help or hinder any impact of the gospel message. And we do well to remember that. We don't have to be perfect in every situation, but just think about this. That person that you've just had a fierce standoff with in the car park of the supermarket, next week comes along to Alpha and is sitting on your table, or you're introduced to them at coffee after a service. It's worth thinking about, isn't it? Whether how we act towards those outside the church might at some point either help or hinder the gospel. He says to make the most of every opportunity. Now, these are two extremes here. There are two extremes of fear of making a mistake, giving us some kind of reason or excuse to not take those opportunities to share something of Jesus. Or so desperate to follow this instruction that when a colleague or a friend uses the words of the Lord's name as an expletive, you see the opportunity, you jump in and you say, oh, Jesus Christ, well, let me tell you about him, whether you like it or not. My friends, the opportunities are there in this age, perhaps more than a long time, than there has been in a long time. They do come up. You know that, I know that, we've experienced it. Sometimes we run away for them. But it's not about having the full gospel message there rehearsed for reeling off to the very slightest hint that someone's interested, but about a willingness to share, when appropriate and with sensitivity, something of your story and your experience with someone else. Paul goes on to say, let your conversation always be full of grace, seasoned with salt. Conversation, it's a two-way street. It's not a theological lecture or preach. These are talking about everyday interactions, a back and forth of their story, of your story, and hopefully in sharing something of your story, they'd hear something of God's story. And he says that your conversation be full of grace and salt. When you talk with people who don't know Jesus, or indeed anyone, do so in the language and the accent of Jesus. I'm not talking about Aramaic or Hebrew. I'm talking about the dialect of grace. Speak as Jesus would speak to them and about them and for them. I remember at Renew not that long ago having a conversation with a lady about life, about faith, about church, the universe, everything. And it did take a bit of a while, but at the end of it, she didn't fall on her knees and commit to Jesus. I'm sorry, I'm not that good an evangelist. But she said at the end of it, thanks, I really enjoyed talking to you. Because of that, the conversation continues. It's not a preachy one. And says, and note to Paul says, so that you may know how to answer everyone. How we communicate with people is actually more significant often than having the right things to say. And with these little pithy statements that Paul fires out at the end of his letter, he starts to sign off. And let's move on to that signing off, Colossians 4, 7 to 18, the final greetings and his partners. And it's very easy when we read Paul's letters and we see it as a whole list of names and we simply scoot over them. But we need to remember these are real people with real stories, real interactions and overlap and encounters with Paul. And the list is actually really interesting. This is what it contains. It contains those people who are taking Paul's news and letter from where he is in prison to Colossae and the regional area. It contains 2 gospel writers, Luke the doctor and Mark. Mark having been reconciled with Paul after a significant falling out, as we see in Acts. It has a mention of 3 Jews, only 3 Jews who are believers, who are alongside Paul. That must be really showing how alienated he felt, so on his own. And then Paul also endorses Epaphras again, the person who founded the Colossian church, whose authority is being challenged by these influencers. He's saying he's earnestly praying for you. He's working really hard for you. He's endorsing Epaphras and his position. And that there was also a church in the house of Nympha, a woman. Now, we don't see the significance of that necessarily, but this is massive, that a woman had a position of significance and authority in the early church. But the key I want us to focus on as we open up the rest of this message is on an individual called Onesimus. It could be just another name if it were not for an accompanying letter which Paul sent to Colossae as well, to an individual called Philemon. And I encourage you to go and read that book. Philemon, it's a great book. It's only 25 verses. It's one of those ones that you feel great about when you've read it, because you feel you've read an entire book of the Bible. It's a personal letter which puts flesh on the bones of what Paul writes to the rest of the church in Colossae. Some of the things that we'll be looking at in just a moment. Before we see it written down in Colossians, we see it lived out in the story of Philemon and Onesimus. But before we get to that story, we need to go back a little bit to the end of chapter 3 in Colossians, because my dear friend and colleague Catherine said that she'd left the end of chapter 3 for me to do. Thanks very much, Catherine. Because this is one of those situations where the dividing lines of chapters and verses aren't at the best places necessarily. Don't blame the writers. It was done much later in the kind of compiling process. And so I'd like us to look at Colossians chapter 3, verse 18 to chapter 4, verse 1. And this contains some of the words of Paul that our more modern frame of reference may find difficult, and maybe we wish that either he hadn't said them or perhaps that he'd gone even further. And in these verses, Paul zooms in on how the gospel impacts one of the key cornerstones of the Roman Empire, the household. He's asking, how is the gospel impacting behind closed doors? Now, generally, in public and especially in church, we put on our best faces, our sorted faces. It's not hypocrisy, it's just what we do, in particular with regards to families, our best behaviour, not just the children, but also parents. But sometimes we get a glimpse of reality. And one day, I'm allowed to share the story, Helen says, she was bathing a couple of our children when they were little, and one of them got into a bit of a rage and bit the other one on the nose. Pandemonium erupts. And Helen takes the biter and puts them on the naughty step, which is just beside our front door, and gives them a stern telling off in a voice louder than she would normally use in conversation. And just at that moment, there's a knock at the door, which she opens to find a member of the church asking for someone's address nearby and looking ever so slightly terrified of Helen. Now, that gave that person a glimpse of what goes on behind closed doors. You or I know what goes on behind our closed doors at our home. We know whether we live out the gospel even there. But whilst we may like having the doors closed when we can keep others out, we can't keep the Lord out. And then our actions and our attitudes, the gospel should impact what we do. And this is what Paul is addressing here. He's not outlining the idealized Christian household for all time. We need to remember that. And it's important because what we know, and perhaps some have even experienced, that these verses and similar ones in Ephesians 5 and 1 Timothy, Titus and 1 Peter have been misunderstood and misused to dominate, to subjugate, and even to abuse. None of which is what they were meant. Quite the opposite, in fact. Paul is not giving an idealized version of what a family household should be. He's speaking into a cultural situation that his listeners are living in. These are not commands to follow. Note that Paul's message is always about full of grace, not law. So something to remember across Paul's teachings. Paul does not say this and that, does not say that it's all grace and not law, and then pile on a whole different set of rules for us to follow. He's giving directives to people in their situation by applying the gospel, by interpreting and living out grace and the message of Jesus. Remember, law, rules are easy. There's no thinking required. Grace is hard. We need to work it out. And that's what Paul is doing here within the Roman household. And it's useful maybe to know how the Roman household was structured. This was the cornerstone of imperial daily life, and the pattern applied from emperor to citizen to servant. And typically there was the head of a household, and the household was much bigger than our kind of 2.4 children mum and dad that we might have today. The head of the household, known as the paterfamilias, was the oldest male of the family. And he was in charge of everything. He was in control of everything. It was his household. And then we have the wife or the mother, the materfamilias. And she was usually much younger. It was often an arranged marriage. She was in charge of the house duties, including looking after children and coordinating the slaves. And then we do have the children, and they were considered the property of the paterfamilias. Until they came of age, they had no status whatsoever. And then there were the slaves, not considered individuals in their own rights. They were the property, they were the things of the family. They had no rights, and they were completely disposable and at the disposal of whatever the paterfamilias wanted. Lots of Roman writers speak about this idealized structure, and Paul seems initially to advocate some things which they would agree on. In verses 18, 20 and 22, he says, "Wives, submit to your husbands. Children, obey your parents. Slaves, obey your masters." And hearing that might make us feel uncomfortable today in our kind of modern mindset. But Paul is actually very subversive in what he's doing. Now, note, these are generalized brushstroke directives. More details, especially in Ephesians 5 and 6, which some consider Ephesians to be the letter to the Laodiceans that Paul refers to at the end of Colossians, that needs to be read in Colossae 2, where it says, in regards to this idea of submission, Paul started by saying, submit to one another. Mutuality, which didn't exist in normal Roman family relations. But he talks about it in Colossians 3:21 when he says, bear with one another in love. All the community, the men, the women, and the children heard this. And that's what's really significant. He, in this letter, actually addresses those people. Remember, this letter is being read out to the entire church audience. And that church audience consists of men, of women, of children, and of slaves. Paul's addressing them. And the church is made up of these different people. That in itself is radical in Greco-Roman culture and religion. But here Paul speaks directly to them, not via their head and their master. They're hearing all these things in the same room to them, in the same room as their husband, their master, their father. That's massive in itself. But as noted, these verses are difficult because they have been used and abused and often are still used to subjugate, to dominate, leading to sexism, misogyny and abuse. And they are done so when they're divorced from the other things that Paul says, because these verses need to be taken in pairs. Notice it says, wives, submit to your husbands. Husbands, love your wives and don't be harsh. Children, obey. Fathers, don't provoke your children and put them down. Slaves, obey. Masters, provide what is right and fair. And unpairing these verses can lead to misuse of them. But it speaks to the head of the household. It speaks directly to him, saying that the head of the household should have a sacrificial, loving responsibility for the benefit and thriving of the entire household, without exception. Now that is massive. And within their first century context that we're looking at here, it's much better to submit to, respect someone who is sold out on looking after you and your well-being. It's easier to obey someone who's not putting you down and antagonizing you. It's easier to serve a person who values you, wants to provide for you and keeps you safe and will not abuse that trust. And we might read these verses and this commands or these directives to the head of the house and go, rightly so. But typical Roman households outside the Christian family would have at least been bemused by what Paul says, and frankly, perhaps even horrified. It unravels the fabric of the Roman household order. But also, we only think that those things are rightly so, that's what husbands and fathers and masters should do, whatever, because we are part of a society which has been reformed and become more in line with how Christ wants us to be. Sadly, though, we still have domestic violence. We still have neglect of children. We still have slavery, which is still an international issue even today. And Paul's words, or any scripture, in fact, should never be used as an excuse or believed in, which leads to any kind of domestic oppression or abuse. That is not what it is written for. The third thing is that all of this is not just to keep a happy household and a perfect Roman family bliss. It's because of the Lord. Paul advises them to submit and obey, not because the head of the house deserves it, but because of the Lord. This seems insignificant, but as we'll see, what Paul is saying is that it's something which is loud and clear, that Christ is the head of the church, not the man. It is Jesus who dictates the lifestyle and ethos of the house. The head of the house is subject to Jesus, as all of them are. Christ is above the head of the house. If Christ is above all, then he must impact our daily lives. It must be lived out, even behind closed doors, and even when it subverts what the rest of culture is dictating. And it's particularly seen in our context here regarding particularly slavery. We can't avoid seeing these words through the legacy and lens of the evil that was the transatlantic slave trade. That was rooted in racist imperialism based on the false idea of the Western enlightened civilized personnel being superior to other peoples, of which sadly the church is not historically guiltless. And there have been current moves, to redress the pervading legacy on those who live in areas and have a result of the slave trade. And maybe we wish Paul was more overt in his condemnation of slavery. However, the situation in the Roman context was a little bit different. It's less about race and more about military and economic purposes. It's still an imperialist idea, the glory of Rome versus the scandal of barbarians. However, anyone could have become a slave. It wasn't to do with race, but also anyone could own a slave. It was a sign of social progress, success, and financial security. And the entire empire was dependent on slavery. It literally powered the empire. And in the first century, there was around 50 million slaves. That was around 20% of the entire population were slaves. And there was a constant fear amongst citizens and authorities that they would revolt. It had happened a number of times. Think about Spartacus and all the movie about that. So the way to prevent that was to completely suppress slaves, their sense of worth and identity, and to control them. It was deeply evil, dehumanizing, and sadly was found across all human history and across cultures. And the idea of ending slavery in ancient Rome was beyond comprehension. It was so entwined in Roman culture. And the mentality of the time is probably best reflected in thinking about them as like how we think about fossil fuels or transportation. Living without them, banning them, it's just far too big to comprehend, to even unravel. However, Paul still subverts and applies the gospel to this aspect of the household. In Colossians 3:11, he says there's no slave or free. That is massive. And in Colossians 3:22 onwards, it says, masters, provide what's right and fair. You're not the boss. And this is not just theoretical. The gospel should impact our context and make a difference. And we have our real life case study here attached to Colossians. So as we look at our list of friends, let's go back to Onesimus and this letter that Paul sends alongside Onesimus and Tychicus to this person, Onesimus, to Philemon. And as we said, This is a personal letter from Paul to Philemon, which puts flesh on the bones of the teaching that he did to Colossians. And what we gather from the short letter is that Philemon, along with his wife Apphia and possibly his son Archippus, were a fairly wealthy family in Colossae. He knew Paul personally, although Paul had not been to Colossae, probably been to Ephesus, and met Paul there, and Paul had led Philemon to Christ. A church now met at his home, which would have been around 50 people. That's how the church met, over a number of houses in a city. Philemon owned slaves, one of whom was Onesimus. And Onesimus had run away, and it was likely that he'd stolen money in the process, but however, a slave running away was in itself considered theft of a possession. And Onesimus, on his runaway, encounters Paul. Now, this may have been in Ephesus or Rome. We don't know exactly where Paul was in prison. And Paul leads Onesimus to Christ. And Onesimus serves Paul while he's in prison and becomes really important to him, to the point that he calls him like a son. And Paul, at this point, when he's sending this letter to the Colossians, also sends Onesimus back. For a number of reasons. It's illegal for him to harbour a runaway slave. It's also dangerous for Onesimus. There will be people looking for him to bring him back. But I think also Paul wants to make a reconciliation for the benefit of both Onesimus and Philemon. And in the midst of it, Paul does another great pun, because Onesimus, his name actually means useful, and he says to Philemon, he was once useless to you, but he's now useful to me. Another great Paul pun. But he writes on behalf of Onesimus, because going back to Philemon is risky. The master of a slave who's run away has every right to kill a returning slave, or to at least have him branded with the letter F on his forehead, meaning fugitive. Or he could have sold someone on somewhere else, or someone else less comfortable and less conducive. And what Paul asks of Philemon is to live out the reality of the gospel. In doing so, he's been completely anti-establishment, going against the expected and the norm. He asks Philemon to take Onesimus back and not punish him. In fact, to embrace him, not as a slave, but as a human being, as a brother in the Lord, as family. And perhaps you've sensed echoes of the parable of the prodigal son here. Paul is asking this of Philemon, not out of a sense of duty or even obedience to Paul, but wanting him to do something that he wants to do, which is in keeping with their partnership in the gospel. That's what he calls him, his partner. Paul's persuading Philemon, subtly reminding him of the truth of the gospel, and that Philemon should be modelling it. That Paul has authority, but he doesn't want to use it, and that he's also willing to pay costs incurred by Onesimus with a personal IOU. All of this for the sake of gospel-fueled reconciliation. He's even bold enough to strongly hint that Philemon would actually free Onesimus. Now just think how countercultural and so very gospel that is. Instead of punishing the runaway, he is actually giving him his freedom. And the ramifications of that seemingly small act in their community would have been significant, upsetting even in that small corner of the empire, something which was so fundamental to the Roman ideal. This was where the power of the gospel undermines the empire of Rome with the kingdom of Christ. You can imagine people saying, "Did you hear what that Christian did? He actually freed his runaway slave. How he must be mad. That's deeply offensive. He needs taking aside. Why would he do that?" What if that spreads? That Christianity means I could be free one day. And you can see from that why Christianity became so popular amongst slaves, but also amongst women, as we heard earlier. You see, Paul, to write that the power source of the empire should be dismantled was too big a concept for him to suggest or for people to get their heads around. But within their households, seeing it as a reality would have that pebble-like effect in a pond. It would spread. The idea of the butterfly effect, the idea that if a butterfly flaps its wings in Tokyo, there'll be rain in Central Park in New York. One small change can influence massive change. Now, we don't know what Philemon did. I suspect Paul had a genuine confidence that Philemon would come through, but it was not guaranteed. It was risky. Would Philemon demonstrate to the fledgling Christian community in Colossae the real life impact of the gospel? Of Paul's empire-challenging statement in Colossians 3, here there's no Jew or Gentile, circumcised, uncircumcised, slave or free, but Christ is in all and as all and in all. Would the church see what Paul had written in Colossians lived out by one of their leaders, massive and countercultural as it was? This was like a litmus test of Philemon's faith and that of the Colossian church community. Would Onesimus be welcomed back? Would would Philemon and the Colossian church live out this gospel of grace? Would it be more than mere words and niceties? Now, we don't know the answer for definite. However, it is recorded in the first century that at Ephesus, the second person who took up the role of bishop of that city was a man called Onesimus. Could it have been him? I don't know, but it's not impossible. There are records of churches being led by pastors a pastor who was a slave, whose master was actually in the church community which he belonged to. And within the first few centuries of the church, at least 4 leaders of the church, 4 popes, were former slaves. As the empire became more Christian, the slave economy dwindled and the church taught against slavery. It became less of a reality. But as we know from our history books, it erupted sadly from particularly the 15th to the 18th centuries, and it was in the 18th century into the 19th when, because of the gospel, William Wilberforce and co., including Thomas Clarkson, John Newton, Hannah More, Olida Equiano, Mary Prince and others led the fight to establish the pervasive slave trade, the very suggestion of which would have been as ludicrous to them then as it was in first century Colossae. But the influence of this little letter to Philemon from Paul, expanding on his letter to the Colossians about how to orient their households with Christ at the head, was felt in the endeavours to end the slave trade. Josiah Wedgwood, the famous porcelain producer, produced in vast quantities a medallion depicting a chained slave with the words taken from Paul's letter to Philemon emblazoned on it, saying, "Am I not a man and a brother?" And this campaign tool, as we would say, went viral and was a significant campaign tool for the abolitionists, leading ultimately to the dismantling of the slave trade, which sadly still in some ways exists internationally as a problem and a reality today. But what happened behind closed doors mattered because it had an impact. And although doors may be closed to other onlookers, they're never closed to the Lord. And how we act, react and conduct ourselves at home with those we work with, when our conversations with those in the streets, must be impacted by the reality that we're not the heads of our households, whether men or women. We act, react and live under the headship of Christ and live in response to his grace to us. Our minor obediences to the way of Christ are not hidden behind closed doors. They spread. They can make an impact on those around us, because the gospel must be lived out for it to be believable to others, for it to really root within us, and for it to be effective in the challenging and changing of the world and context in which we live. Over the last few weeks, we've journeyed with Paul and the young Colossian church from the cosmic eternal supremacy of Jesus to the freedom from the trappings of the law which held us captive, to seeing how Jesus wants us, in response to what Jesus has done for us, wants us to respond to him, not to gain his love. How this headship of Christ should impact how we live and how we interact with others around us in our conversations, our work, and especially in our households, whatever they look like. Jesus Christ is the head, not us. Christ is above all.